Hello, everyone, and welcome. My apologies for the late start in the symposium. We had a little bit of a technical issue, but here we are. My name is Ted Walter. I am the executive director of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. We are a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to establishing an accurate account of the events of September 11th, 2001, and to fostering a worldwide realization and reckoning about the truth surrounding those events. As part of our mission of researching and educating the events of 9/11, we believe it is important to look at 9/11 within the broader historical context of other deep structural deep events, or state crimes against democracy, which are similar or even connected to the events of 9/11. And so it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this symposium, which we are holding in honor of Graeme MacQueen, who passed away about a year ago. And in this symposium, we are going to be exploring the parallels and the possible connections between the 9/11 and COVID events. Now, before I go any further, I would just like to recognize and thank UK Column for co-sponsoring this event with us. UK Column is a fearless independent news organization based in the UK that is responsible for live streaming the talks you're about to see. I'd also like to say that I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague and friend, Marilyn Langlois. Marilyn, among her many other areas of activism and activities, serves on the board of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And was also my co-executive producer on the film Peace, War, and 9/11, which features and is based on the research of Dr. Graeme MacQueen. So before I go any further, I'd like to give Marilyn just an opportunity to say hi, and then in a few moments, she'll share further remarks.
Hello, I'm glad to be here and welcome to you all. Hope you enjoy this program.
Thanks. So as I said, this event is very much dedicated to honoring Graeme MacQueen. Graeme, as many people know, was a leading researcher of the events of 9/11. He was also a lifelong anti-war activist. He was a professor of religious studies at McMaster University for about 30 years. And he passed away a little bit more than a year ago on April 25th, 2023. And Graeme was quite instrumental in helping to form the new International Center for 9/11 Justice, which was launched about a year ago in June of last year. And he's essentially a founding member of the organization and a dear friend of many of ours. As we thought about, it was clear to us that we wanted to honor Graeme as we came up on the 1 year anniversary. And as we thought about it, we decided that the best way to do that would be to hold a symposium where we would really explore in depth and educate the public about two events that he cared about deeply. One of those, of course, was 9/11. He's dedicated so much of his life to understanding what happened that day. But the other one that is less known about is the events of the COVID-19 pandemic. He, like many people around the world, millions of people, very quickly grew skeptical of the narrative that was being presented to us. He didn't write anything about it because he was very busy in the last years of his life finishing up his work on 9/11. But he was very concerned about it, and he showed a lot of solidarity and did engage in activism around the COVID events. And there's two reasons in particular that we wanted to do this symposium in honor of Graeme. One is that Graeme, as many people will know, did some very important research into the anthrax attacks and wrote a book called The 2001 Anthrax Deception. And these are the anthrax attacks that followed on the heels of the 9/11 events. And Graeme, I think, persuasively made the case in his book that the anthrax attacks were essentially part two of the operation that began with 9/11. And I think we can also look at the anthrax attacks as an important step or instrumental moment in the evolution of the biowarfare and biosecurity state. And really, for me at least, I'm not aware. It's the first event I'm aware of where actors within the U.S. National security apparatus actually used a pathogen on the U.S. population and even members of Congress in order to instill fear in the general population and to further a specific political goal. And so Dr. Meryl Nass, who's going to be speaking at the end of this, the last speaker of the symposium, is going to, I think, tell us a little bit more, tell that story of how the anthrax attacks fit into the evolution of the biosecurity state that we are looking at today. The other reason I think is that if Graeme were still with us, I think he would be arguing for the sort of unification, or at least for having tremendous solidarity between the 9/11 truth movement and the what I guess I would call the COVID resistance movement. I think it's clear to many that at a minimum, we're talking about very similar methods being used in terms of this being a structural deep event and how it was carried out. And we're possibly also dealing with at least overlapping actors behind these events. Now, I'm not an expert in that. Some of the people that are going to be speaking after me are going to explore that question more deeply. But I think that fortunately we have started to see a lot of progress in this regard. In terms of the 9/11 truth movement, probably a majority of the 9/11 truth movement does embrace a skeptical position on the COVID events. I think that there is still a segment that is perhaps reluctant to. And speaking from my own experience, I would say that probably has more than anything to do with the difficulty of wrapping one's head around what are the forces and what is the agenda that we're dealing with here. If you come from a sort of traditional left perspective and you've been concerned about the events of 9/11 for a long time, it might be because you see imperialists or militarists as perhaps as really the actors behind 9/11, and you might have more trouble understanding or wrapping your head around what are we talking about with COVID-19? What's the agenda here? Who's behind it? And so I think some of the speakers are going to be able to shed some light there and help make some connections. On the COVID side, I think that there is a tremendous openness to studying 9/11 critically. I think that we've seen a resurgence in interest in 9/11 in the last year or two because of the COVID resistance movement. But I would still say that there's prominent members of the COVID resistance, whether it be researchers, thinkers, or media figures, who don't embrace a critical perspective of 9/11. And I would posit that their perspective, their analysis of COVID might be deepened and strengthened by also looking critically at the events of COVID. And I would also posit that 9/11 might offer a uniquely revolutionary potential that COVID as an issue on its own at least does not quite possess. And so I would like to see the coming together of these two movements even more. And I think all four of the speakers that are going to speak today can be very powerful voices in that regard. All four of them have fearlessly looked at the events of 9/11, the anthrax attacks, and the events of COVID, and straddled those issues eloquently and in a rigorous way. And so I look forward to these talks tremendously. And just to very quickly run through the speakers, and then I will. I'm also we're going to play a short video clip from Peace War 9/11 for people who do not know Graeme MacQueen or didn't have a chance to see that film. And then Marilyn's going to share some thoughts. But just to very briefly run through the speakers, we're going to be hearing first from Dr. Niels Harrit. Dr. Harrit is perhaps best known for his research into nanothermitic material found in the dust from the World Trade Center. And he is going to be speaking on 9/11 COVID as two sides of the same coin. We're then going to hear from Dr. Piers Robinson, who is the research director of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And he's going to speak about understanding the agendas of contemporary global power elites. Next, after that, we're going to hear from Dr. Madhava Setty. Madhava is an anesthesiologist and a former senior science editor at Children's Health Defense. And he's going to speak about common challenges facing the 9/11 and health freedom movements. And last but not least, Dr. Meryl Nass. Meryl is a medical doctor and a biological warfare researcher, and she is going to speak about the WHO pandemic preparedness agenda and efforts currently underway, which she's helping to lead to prevent the passage of the WHO pandemic preparedness treaty. So with that, I would like to play the clip from Peace War 9/11 and then ask Marilyn to share her remarks.
And we're all supposed to believe this was Al-Qaeda who sent these. Al-Qaeda has somehow taken a great dislike to senators in the Democratic Party who are trying to hold up the Patriot Act. It's ridiculous, okay? These were very sophisticated anthrax letters, highly weaponized stuff. When an aide opened the letter for Daschle in the office, it floated out like cigarette smoke and quickly contaminated the entire Hart Senate building, which then had to be closed for several months for cleaning. It's not easy to get anthrax to behave that way, and we've had several studies of it which show that it's the most sophisticated anthrax spores ever seen, and the only people that we know for sure that can make it are in the United States. Dugway Proving Ground or Battelle Memorial Institute, those are the two main suspects. And Iraq, which they tried to implicate, was nowhere near that in their sophistication. Even if they still had their anthrax program going, which they didn't, they had destroyed it, but even if they had, they couldn't make that stuff. And I don't know how it is that the planners failed, and some honest scientists jumped over the fence at some point here, but they did. And so then the whole thing started to collapse. There was no case against Iraq. So then they were forced into a desperate move, what's called a limited hangout. We will admit some things are true in order to protect the big truths. We will admit now that this is by December 2001, so this is happening quickly. We will admit that this didn't come from Iraq, even though we said it did. Didn't come from Al-Qaeda, even though the letters looked like it did. Came from somehow within our own military-industrial complex. But it was a guy. It was one guy, a sick guy. It was the lone nut. And they charged, ultimately, Bruce Ivins. First it was Stephen Hatfill, then it was Bruce Ivins, who conveniently took his own life before he could go to trial. And so then they proclaimed the whole thing was over, the case had been solved, case dismissed. Tried to put the anthrax attacks to bed.
Thank you. And very moving always to see Graeme's face here. If you haven't seen the whole film, I encourage you to watch it. I'm really happy to be part of this event commemorating 1 year since our beloved colleague Graeme MacQueen transitioned to the ancestors. And it's only fitting that we'll offer you the outstanding lineup of speakers that Ted enumerated just now, who all evoke the impeccable principles Graeme embodied. When I first met Graeme 13 years ago, I was pleasantly surprised to learn that in addition to his extensive knowledge and research about 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, he was also open to exploring pervasive media deception around other deep events, including the JFK, MLK, and RFK assassinations. When the COVID mass hysteria kicked into gear, with the lockdowns, masks, impending vaccine mandates, etc., I was relieved but no longer surprised to learn that Graeme also questioned the official narrative about COVID. And we had several conversations about that during the last couple years of his life. In a presentation he gave here in Oakland, California in 2016, Graeme identified the TUR method used by the power elites to control people's perception and behavior. The T stands for threat, the U stands for unity, and the R stands for response. He gave some examples of how this was applied to US Congress members on 9/11 and to Canadian parliamentarians in 2014 when there was a false flag attack there by Here's how it works. First, they threaten people with an unexpectedly shocking and lethal attack. And then promptly, this prompts political enemies and adversaries, overcome with emotion, to become unified, even hugging each other, and then go along with whatever ready response is laid out in the voice of. We both agreed that this exact same phenomenon occurred with the rollout of the COVID event, minus the hugging, of course. Now, as a peace activist all his life, Graeme recognized the importance of not only seeing through the hype with a critical eye, but also engaging in grassroots mobilization and mass action to counter the nefarious agendas. In January 2022, even though he was in a weakened state from his advanced cancer, he bundled up and went outside in the freezing sub-zero weather to stand with others on a freeway crossing in Hamilton, Ontario, and cheered on the Canadian truckers who were driving through his area during their protest against the unjust vaccine mandates. Were he alive today, Graeme would surely be out there protesting the machinations of the corrupt and captured World Health Organization to ensnare us all in a totalitarian biosecurity state. So, as you'll see, today's program will connect lots of dots and offer important pathways for taking action. Ted, back to you.
Thanks, Marilyn. That was wonderful. Let's bring on Niels now. Can we welcome Niels?
I'm here.
Hi, Niels. It's great to see
Hi.
you. Let me give
Great
a brief
to see
introduction.
you as well. Okay.
All right. So, for those who don't know, and there are some details that most people won't be aware of here, Niels was born in 1945. He served as associate professor of chemistry at the University of Copenhagen from 1971 to 2009, and published more than 60 peer-reviewed papers. Since 2007, he's been actively involved in the global movement for 9/11 Truth. He was a lead author of the scientific paper, as I mentioned before, on thermitic material and industrial collapses of the 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers. He was also a member of the 9/11 Consensus Panel, which now forms part of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. Over the years, Niels has given some 400 presentations, which is truly remarkable, on the collapses of the World Trade Center skyscrapers in countries across the world. Since 2020, his activity has been extended to cover the false narratives of the so-called COVID-19 pandemic from a scientific perspective. And Niels, it's an honor to have you here. You've been a guiding light for so many in the 9/11 research community, and a source of inspiration, just like our friend Graeme MacQueen. So thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Well, we can all point to people who change our lives in a decisive way. And Graeme MacQueen was such a person. More than most, Graeme MacQueen has bended the trajectory of many people's lives in a more honest, dedicated, uncompromising, and fearless direction. I was one of them as I got involved in the global 9/11 Truth movement after 2006. Graeme did many things for everyone to see: teaching, giving presentations, writing articles and books. But he also worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make things happen. So looking back from today's occasion, you have to appreciate how much of an important force he were in the years, at least until 9/11 morphed into COVID-19. But for anyone who had the privilege to meet and know him personally, Graeme's impact went beyond the sheer fruits of his acts. Peace activism was not only something he did. For Graeme MacQueen, peace was a state of mind. There simply wasn't a single aggressive fiber in that man. He acted on his indignation, communicated the truth in accordance with his gentle personality, without yelling, but never hiding his contempt and his disdain. I subscribe to that approach. What you present must, by necessity, be facts from the physical world we share. You address and eventually convince the brain, but you've got to reach the heart and win it over. Graeme did that simply by being the man he was. Now he has left the physical world, but the fight for peace goes on and has taken new dimensions. As I refer to the year 2006 as the time when I woke up, it is not accidental. Many had the same experience. And I believe this is due to the advent of videos on the internet. Suddenly you could see the third skyscraper collapsing on Manhattan. And everybody could review the collapses of the World Trade Center Twin Towers, see how tons of building debris, steel beams, and girders were thrown up and out horizontally during the destruction. But gravity is vertical. Okay? It's game over. It should have been game over for the official story, according to which the only force acting on the towers at that moment was gravity. So the official narrative was proven wrong at that moment. The obvious was covered up by the media, as we all know, so the real perpetrators got a clear path for what was called the War on Terror, although you may wonder how terror can be countered by war. That war was never meant to end. It became wars, and they are still ongoing, but they have changed. The War on Terror was launched as an old-time war, a matter of bombs, destruction, killing, plundering, and theft. This is a territorial, horizontal war. Gradually, it turned into a vertical war, a war by the top against the bottom, a war against all of us. Already the passing of the Patriot Act, a month and a half after 9/11, represented a power grab without precedents, indicating that the coming 9/11 wars were launched as part of a plan beyond just stealing and controlling the oil of the Middle East. In this symposium in honor of Graeme MacQueen, it is pathetic irony that one of the major contributions of Graeme was his work on the anthrax deception, as already has been pointed out previously. That was a blatant false flag attack on society in general, and as we have been told, Capitol Hill in particular, which paved the way for the swift passing of the Patriot Act. It was a prelude to the biological warfare we are confronting today. And I cannot refrain from putting in a footnote here and point out, let us remember, that the precursor to the Patriot Act was drafted by then Senator Joe Biden in the mid-90s. Okay. Similar infringements of our civil rights were introduced in many other countries and consolidated during the zeros and the 10th with a stream of staged false flag terror events. Some of them simply played out only on the TV screen without any real events happening. And eventually, people got numb. Then all of a sudden, the standard terror scare disappeared from the public domain in January 2020 and gave way to a new scare, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. I personally believe that the launch of COVID-19 was premature. They clearly were not ready to pull this off. But the lockdowns of the US society was a necessary condition for the rigging of the succeeding presidential election in 2020. Thus, the whole CV-19 scam became to be based on a test which simply did not work as a diagnostic tool. Or rather, the PCR technology was misused to such an extent that you were better served by flipping a coin. You can tune the analytic parameters of the RT-PCR test to such an extent that every test comes out positive. That is, the number of infected was a political decision. But the absence of casualties was evident. As one medical doctor and friend of mine expressed, now we have a test, we only miss the disease. Some people died from the new influenza, while the good old influenza had disappeared. Whenever the deceased had produced a positive PCR test, and some were even run post-mortem, it was registered as a corona death. But there was no excess mortality in 2020. That is, there was no pandemic in the true old meaning of the word. In my country of Denmark, excess mortality didn't start before April 2021, when the vaccinations really took off. But at the same time, some alarming research began to appear in the medical literature. Up until that point, we had been entertained about the smart operational principle of the new vaccines. Instead of injecting dead or weakened viruses in order to activate the immune system, the mRNA in the injection would program our own cells to produce an innocent signal protein from the SARS-CoV-2, which then would activate our immune system so that it could resist the invasion when the real virus came along. But in April 2001, however, work was published that this now famous spike protein damaged the endothelium, that is the cells lining up your veins. Hey, I remember myself, this was a revelation. The spike protein was the pathogen, the very cause of the illness called COVID-19. That is, the vaccine programmed your own cells to do exactly what the virus does to make you sick. In other words, you get COVID-19 from the jab. Even worse, when you get the second shot and the booster, a new population of spike-producing cells are created, and these are registered as an invasive force by the immune system and attacked accordingly. We recognize the strategy, right? A civil war had been staged. But this time the civil war is staged in your own body. In medical terms, it's called an autoimmune response. And another pivotal publication appeared at the same time. It was namely demonstrated that the messenger RNA code for the spike protein could be reverse transcribed into the DNA of the cell nucleus. That is, the code, the recipe for the spike protein becomes for life. In principle, it can also be inherited if the mRNA code is reverse transcribed into reproductive cells. This has caused some to call the vaccines gene therapy. But there isn't any therapy here. It comes across as an attack on the gene pool of the billions of people who have taken the shots. And nobody knows where or when this will end. We remember how President George Bush Jr. triumphantly declared mission accomplished on May 1st, 2003 on this warship, after the invasion of Afghanistan, which was prompted by the 9/11 attacks. In a morbid parallel to this announcement, the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm granted the 2023 Nobel Prize in Medicine to the COVID-19 vaccines, or more specifically, for introducing some very specific chemical modifications of the mRNA used in the CV-19 shots. We had been told on television by our medical authorities that the mRNA in the vaccines was the same as human mRNA and would be degraded within hours in the body, as such genetic waste material is supposed to be. That was another lie. So such a vaccine couldn't fulfill the purpose for more than one reason. So the mRNA in the vaccines is partly synthetic. It is not real mRNA. It has been modified in such a way as to resist the clearing enzymes, and it remains in the body for at least weeks. But the coding efficiency is intact. The celebration in Stockholm in December was lavish, symphony orchestra and the royal family. I guess very few people in the hall understood the underlying implications. All the lies, all the blatant open falsehoods, plain for everyone to see, are common features of 9/11 and CV19. But you cannot see what you don't want to see. You want your prime minister, the king, the judge, the doctor, the pastor to be your good protector. It hurts to realize that you may have been deceived by the very people you have empowered. You don't want to see that. You don't want to see that the emperor has no clothes. You really do want to see his beautiful dress, and you pretend that you do in order to avoid being expelled from the tribe. But when the innocent child in the crowd saw what everyone could see, and a loud mumble went through the crowd, many people tend to believe that a similar moment of revelation has been reached in today's Western society. Well, unfortunately, not yet. Because what happened after the child called out the obvious? Nothing, absolutely nothing happened. The emperor simply carried on. The royal household kept a straight face. The procession continued back to the castle, only to find that the weavers were gone, and so were the money. Still, something did happen after 9/11. An awakening started. Those who had seen the naked legs of the emperor and beyond never forgot that sight. Because truth is a one-way street. There is no way back. Sometimes you wish there were. Like one participant in a presentation I gave many years ago, who came up to me afterwards and asked, "Wouldn't you rather be stupid and happy?" You may be tempted to answer yes, before you realize that there is no choice. You cannot shut up your inner voice. At least it's very unwise if you try and if you want to live an honest life. As another feature common to 9/11 and CV19 is the enormity of the events. The controlled demolitions of the 3 skyscrapers on Manhattan were awesome technical achievements. There were no rehearsals. And which international force could possibly organize the lockdown of about 190 countries within days after the pandemic was declared in March of 2020? There seems to be no other answer to that question than the CIA and the affiliated global intelligence networks merging into the military pharmaceutical complex. Still, in terms of range and consequence, 9/11 is dwarfed by CV19. After all, the first preceded the second, and more than half of the world's population ended up being vaccinated. Everyone has been impacted, directly, indirectly, short-term, long-term. 9/11 featured the controlled demolition of just 3 high-rises, while the CV19 pandemic initiated the controlled demolition of the Western civilization. No less. Still ongoing, even accelerating. But if we try to see 9/11 and CV19 as 2 sides of the same coin, we are immediately left with the question, what coin? What are the true core features of our enemy? Have the global elite become so filthy rich because they are soulless psychopaths? Or is power the ultimate drug, mercilessly destroying even the purest soul once he tries to put on the master ring? Or do we have to accept the existence of pure evil. Yuval Hariri, a man by many considered as the voice of World Economic Forum, recently said in an interview, quote, "If things come to worse when the flood comes, the scientists will build a Noah's Ark for the elite, leaving the rest to drown." End of quote. Here we are getting into mythological and religious territory as old as mankind itself, a territory Graeme MacQueen was better qualified to navigate than most. One reason our enemy can get along with their attack on humanity is that ordinary people simply cannot fathom their mindset. All we can say is that our enemy is everything Graeme MacQueen was not. And all we can do is follow his lead, as expressed in the closing line in the documentary Peace, Wars, and 9/11, quote, "I have done my best and I can go with a satisfied mind." Thank you.
Thank you, Niels, for that incredibly moving tribute to Graeme and for your incisive analysis of the psychological operations inflicted upon us with both 9/11 and COVID-19. I loved how you evoked your countryman, Hans Christian Andersen, whose prescient fairy tale about the emperor's new clothes is so relevant for us still today. And thank you for persistently calling out the truth and courageously doing so. It's much, much appreciated. So now we're going to move along to hear Piers Robinson talk about understanding contemporary global power elite agendas, also from 9/11 to COVID-19. Dr. Piers Robinson has 25 years of experience researching, writing, teaching, and public speaking about international politics, communications, and propaganda. He got his PhD at the University of Bristol in 2000 and has taught at universities of Liverpool, Manchester, and Sheffield. Since leaving Sheffield in 2019, Piers has been involved in the development of a number of initiatives relating to the study of propaganda, including the establishment of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, the Working Group on Syria, Media, and Propaganda, the Working Group on Propaganda and the 9/11 Global War on Terror, and in 2022, the online journal Propaganda in Focus. He is currently part of the Berlin Group 21, which is representing issues raised by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, scientists regarding the manipulation of chemical weapons investigations in Syria. In the last 4 years, both 9/11 and COVID-19 have become a central research concern for Piers. In particular, he has analyzed the propaganda surrounding these events and their role as structural deep events, a phrase coined by Peter Dale Scott. Since 2023, he has served as a board member and as of January 2024, as a research director of the International Center for 9/11 Justice and is co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies. So Piers, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay, I'm going to just make a few comments, in a sense, initial comments about questions surrounding the political actors who we think are behind the COVID-19 event. And I mean, first and foremost, the starting point, I think, and I think most of the evidence indicates this fairly clearly now, is that COVID-19 is not a public health crisis in any accurate sense of it. It can't be understood in that way in any accurate sense of the term. It's essentially a political event or an economic event which has occurred, or, as has been mentioned by Marilyn and also Ted, a structural deep event. And of course, this is Peter Dale Scott's concept. Now, what is a structural deep event? Well, according to Scott, and this is just a sort of potted summary of this analysis, is that essentially a structural deep event is a situation whereby an event is exploited by sorry, I'm just going back to the correct slide. It's an event which is exploited by political elites in order to further specific agendas. And this can involve, right, instigating an event. It can also involve taking advantage of events which occur. And I'll come up to that point later on. But essentially, the picture which Peter Dale Scott paints with the idea of a structural deep event is you have networks of legitimate actors, political actors, and also illegitimate political actors, criminal or deep state actors, along with other non-democratic or unelected entities who are involved in exploiting events in order to push forward political agendas. And the critical thing, and this is why Peter Dale Scott describes these as structural deep events, is that they are events which political elites use in order to create long-standing structural change in a society. And I think with COVID-19, the evidence is fairly clear. It will probably be pretty clear to many of the viewers of this live stream. But just to go through the basic indicators, and this is based upon work that we're developing within IC 911 in terms of identifying the components of structural deep events and so on. But COVID-19 has all the telltale signs of a structural deep event, as Peter Dale Scott would understand it. You have, of course, evidence of foreknowledge and planning in relation to COVID-19. So we have the infamous Event 201 in October of 2019 involving the World Health Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, etc., essentially gaming or creating scenario planning for a major coronavirus global pandemic. There's plenty of other examples of foreknowledge and preparation in the run-up to the official declaration of a pandemic. You have the World Health Organization, for example, in late November issuing tweets saying everyone should be scared. The next big virus pandemic is just around the corner, and so on. And you also have, of course, really sort of in late December of 2019, and this is prior to the sort of formal identification of China telling the World Health Organization of the sort of the process of declaring a global emergency. You have, for example, contracts being issued for the production of a vaccine in relation to this virus, and other indicators of preparation. And then when you get into January, literally just as where the first information is being passed over to the World Health Organization about a new pneumonia of unknown etiology, etc., you already have sort of planning and processes being put in place. You have Drosten and the PCR test. In fact, Drosten working on a PCR test prior to New Year's Eve in 2020. And getting the PCR tests in place, which, as Niels described, this became a critical mechanism which essentially enabled them to construct the perception of a major global pandemic. So foreknowledge and planning, and again, that parallels to a large extent with what we see with 9/11. There's plenty of evidence of foreknowledge, etc., in the run-up to 9/11. And of course, all of the game planning on regime change wars, and that information has come to light over time through testimony, but also through documents, etc. But you have substantial evidence of actors in the know, knowing of something big which is about to occur, and the evidence is very clear with that with COVID-19. Second key feature, you have this rapid reaction to events that you see with COVID-19. Mentioned PCR tests already being devised literally as China is informing the World Health Organization of an unknown pneumonia affecting a small number of people. You have throughout January of 2020, you then have the Davos, the World Economic Forum conference, and you have tabletop discussions there talking about, well, this looks like it's going to be the big one. And so really by within 6 or 7 weeks, and actually when, according to Paul Schreier, the actual the COVID-19 levels were dropping in China, you have the declaration of a global pandemic occurring. All of this with minimal sort of investigation and establishment scientifically of there being a major dangerous pandemic. And this is one of the things that you see very clearly if you go back through the chronology and the timeline. That there's no moment there that you can identify where you have credible scientists saying, look, we have a really dangerous virus on the loose and it's harming lots of people. We need to do something. You don't have any of that. You have careful, methodical planning, actions being taken and so on through the course of December and January, all pointing towards this being essentially an instigated structural deep event. Of course, again, the parallel there with 9/11 is very clear. When 9/11 occurred, within days, you saw the firming up of the regime change war planning, attacking multiple countries. Within 3 or 4 days, a British embassy cable was informing the British government that, well, the hawks in Washington are going to use 9/11 now to start a series of wars to clear up other problems in the international system, etc. So that kind of rapid reaction or rapid activity immediately following an event with minimal investigation. And then, of course, with 9/11, it rolled into the invasion of Afghanistan very quickly. And with COVID-19, again, the same process of just suddenly, rapidly reacting without very little evidence in support and implementing essentially with COVID-19 a state of crisis, of a medical emergency on a global level. Manipulation of science is a key feature that we've seen with 9/11 in terms of, for example, the manipulation of scientific investigations into the building collapses. COVID-19, we see the same process. Mentioned already, the PCR test rushed through peer review, and then that became the way of identifying and in a sense, sort of creating this impression of a global, rapidly spreading pandemic. You have obviously, there's been a large amount written on the way in which purported deaths attributed to COVID-19 were being recorded and so on, and exaggerating essentially the death toll, which could be linked to any particular virus. So you have those kind of processes of manipulation going across both of these cases, which again points to the way in which elites are manipulating the event. They have to manipulate public perceptions and understanding. They have to manipulate the science in order to maintain the narrative. The fourth characteristic, which is a telltale sign of a structural deep event, manipulation of media and propaganda. We see it obviously with 9/11. 9/11, very, very quickly, the media got on board with the official US narrative, and of course, also very quickly got on board with the wars, which were then prosecuted in the international system. Minimal questioning from the media about, well, is it even a good idea to respond to 9/11 through this military war, global war against terror, etc. Media pretty much became mouthpieces for the official position and also for the promotion of the wars that we saw following 9/11. COVID-19, again, there's, despite the level of censorship that there is on mainstream academia, there's still some studies starting to come out now, and it shows the role of media manipulation and propaganda in the case of COVID-19. Most prominently, and keeping in mind that there's two sides of the coin of propaganda. One is promotion, the other is censorship. We saw very, very early on dissenting scientists being pretty brutally suppressed, pushed off social media and so on, smeared, etc., in order to shut down any kind of critical questioning of what was going on. Examples abound, of course. We saw these images coming from China of people who are apparently falling dead from COVID-19 on the spot, etc. All strong indications of major propaganda campaigns and significant manipulation of the media in this case. The final telltale sign with COVID-19, as with the 9/11 structural deep event, the hidden agenda was to initiate a series of major regime change wars in the international system. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Iran, these are all the countries which are being tabled for military action prior to 9/11, and you see the documents sort of coming out immediately after 9/11 through the British inquiries, which confirmed that this was the kind of planning that was going on. So that was your hidden agenda there, was to start regime change wars, which had very, very little to do with fighting Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. With COVID-19, I mean, many would argue that the agendas aren't particularly hidden, that with COVID-19, we saw, of course, that the push for the Great Reset, which was a kind of a structural political, economic vision about how our society should be organized. Others have argued that there's a key economic component to the COVID-19 structural deep event. So there was a drive to try and solve a crisis within the finance markets, within the repo markets, and this created the Going Direct plan, which was in plan months before COVID hit, which was then implemented and accelerated as we saw the process of lockdowns and so on during COVID-19. So you had an economic agenda, you have a political agenda, and there are other arguments in circulation there, which I might pick up on later, as to what was the sort of driving force behind COVID-19 as a structural deep event. So I think the telltale sign is very clear. What this question raises inevitably, with 9/11, we know this is PNAC trying to start a global war, attacks on countries, and using the 9/11 deception in order to mobilize the public to do that. With COVID-19, broadly speaking, there have been two, as far as I read the literature at the moment, two broad arguments have emerged about how do we understand the actors behind this. One is rooted around this notion of a global power elite. Operating, some describe it as a class block. Case van der Pijl's work, States of Emergencies, talk about an emergence of a high-tech pharma class block operating on a global level, involving the big corporations, global oligarchy, transnational power elite class block, and so on. Operating through major financial actors, Bank for International Settlements, and also through institutions such as the World Health Organization, World Economic Forum, United Nations. And associated with this kind of analysis is that there's a lot of infiltration of government by these actors. And really the broad picture that's painted here is that you have a relatively unified globalist elite bloc, which is driving the COVID-19 event, responsible for its instigation, certainly responsible for its exploitation for various political agendas. Now, there is a tendency from this point of view to downplay or to de-emphasize certain components of what we see in the world around us. Some people who argue for the kind of global power elite bloc being behind this tend to shift attention away from the ongoing conflicts that we see in the international system, Ukraine, Palestine, the Middle East situation. Also tend to shift attention away from what some people would describe as the geopolitical situation, BRICS, China, the Russian Federation, and the broader shifts in distribution of power in the international system, shifts in ideational, economic, and military power away from the West and towards China, Russia, and to the global South. Tendency to de-emphasize, some would say, is a blind spot. The second sort of broad position is that the picture described is very similar. You have major corporations who are involved in the construction, instigation of the COVID-19 event. Same actors in play, World Health Organization, World Economic Forum. But the emphasis from this perspective as to understanding what's driving the COVID-19 event is that these are primarily Western-centric power elites who are behind this, who are driving this. But there's a fourth component to this analysis, which is different from the kind of globalist analysis, and that's that the political, military, economic power struggles that we're seeing in the international system at the moment are still very important and do reflect genuine conflict between elite blocs in the international system. And so there you see the unipolarity, multipolarity debates occurring. Now, as with the first sort of hypothesis or theory about what's driving this approach also has a tendency to de-emphasize certain elements of what we can see out there in terms of what's happening in the world. there is a tendency, not from all people from this position, but at least some of them, to downplay or to have a less developed understanding of the relationship between the transnational elites and financial actors, and how they link back down to nation states. So this sort of interface between nation states, major powers, transnational corporations, and global oligarchs, I think is not fully or adequately mapped in that sense. And there's also a tendency to underestimate what I think is there, how strong it is up for debate, the globalist power elite network, this sort of very highly ideological bloc which has been pushing, for example, transhumanism, pushing the fourth industrial revolution and so on. So sometimes with a kind of Western-centric analysis of what's driving COVID-19, it's the Western power elites behind this rather than the globalist power elites. There is a tendency to not sort of pay sufficient attention to that component of what we see going on. There are others in this position who really fall down into not paying any attention at all to COVID-19. I don't want to get into that territory, but that's certainly sort of one element of what we see out there. And I think what this has all created is that in terms of us trying to understand from a sociological or from a political science point of view of understanding what's going on, what is driving what we are seeing in front of us, there's a tendency to create blind spots or tunnel vision, where some people are simply focusing upon the Western power elites, the military-industrial complex and the wars, and then others who are just simply focusing upon what they perceive to be a globalist elite who are driving what's going on. And this causes, I think, clear blind spots and in a sense, an inability to have a more holistic understanding of the kind of power dynamics that we have in play at the moment. How do we get beyond this? Moving forward. Whoops. There we go. Moving forward. First of all, I mean, the first thing to say about this, just for some closing remarks, I mean, all of these ideas is essentially work in process. I'm working with Kevin Ryan, developing a paper on the 9/11 COVID-19 comparison. Did a paper with Vanessa Beeley published through UK Column, talking about some of these issues of the power dynamics. So this is work in progress and being developed. But I think first and foremost, it's very clear that you can have cooperation and conflict in the international system at the same time. So it's entirely plausible to have cooperation between elite power blocs over COVID-19, for example, between the major power centers in the world, whilst you also have conflict going on. The wars that we're seeing in Ukraine, the kind of battle over the global economic financial system and so on. So, we need to recognize that there's a possibility for cooperation and conflict, and that can change over time. The second point is that a lot of people in these two broad camps do tend to work with a set of assumptions or black boxes about what they think is behind COVID-19. And the problem with that is that, assumptions and black boxes, you always have to work with, assumptions to some extent, but you need to justify the assumptions. And I think the problem is that not enough work has been done in order to sufficiently understand the actors and the relationships between them in order to be confident in those assumptions. So there is a kind of tendency to proceed in a sense of people have a worldview about what they think is important and unimportant, and then proceed according to that worldview. And I think that's problematic because it creates these blind spots or tunnel vision that I've been talking about. The third point, and this is, just trying to be as objective about this as possible, a level of circumspection and recognition of uncertainties is important whenever you're going about trying to understand complex phenomena, and for sure, understanding COVID-19, the array of global actors, the international system, understanding all this is extremely complex. If you look at the field of international relations scholarship, you have big areas of research going on for decades, looking at the international system in radically different ways without any agreement between the realists, the liberals, the Marxists, and so on and so forth. So some kind of recognition, I think, of the uncertainties of our knowledge is important. But this comes to the final point, and this really goes back to the kind of two broad sort of accounts or perspectives that I've been describing, is that all of this is amenable to rigorous empirical analysis. Network analysis, for example, is a tool that we have, a sociological tool, which allows us to map interests, actors, relationships between them. And I think that kind of work, although laborious and painstaking and takes a lot of time and resources. But that kind of work, I think, is essential in order to start to get a better understanding of what's driving COVID-19, how the COVID-19 event interfaces with the other major changes we're seeing in the international system, shifts in the distribution of power, the military conflicts, and so on. And, we have to sort of really get our heads down and buckle down with that kind of rigorous empirical analysis through network analysis in order to get a better grasp of the various theories that there are out there as to who and what is behind the COVID-19 event. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Piers, thank you very much. That was tremendous. That was very illuminating and clarifying. And I think it's very important to emphasize that we shouldn't have such a high degree of certainty, and that there's much still to be studied and understood, which is a challenge, because we also want to be able to respond quickly when these types of events start to unfold. We want to be able to resist them. And yet, so you have both of these tendencies at play, and it's difficult to navigate. But certainly from an academic perspective and trying to understand things deeply, we have to be circumspect. So I appreciate that. I do want to. Piers mentioned his paper on the UK Column website. I just want to point out the title of that: "Understanding Power Dynamics and Moving Beyond Divisions." And you can find that I believe still linked on the homepage of the UK Column website. Very, very clarifying and elucidating. I also want to say Piers's paper, "Cock Up or Conspiracy," is very helpful for kind of understanding the layers of motivations and agendas that are possibly at play with the COVID-19 event specifically. And so that's on a number of platforms. If you Google "Cock Up or Conspiracy," you can find that one. And yeah, so thank you so much, Piers. I would like to welcome on David Chandler next. David is a member as well of the board of directors of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. He was a physics teacher and math teacher, and he has played a critical role in the evolution of our understanding about the events of 9/11, specifically his analysis of the events at the World Trade Center, the free fall collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, and many other critical observations regarding the destruction of the Twin Towers. And so his contribution has been seminal and critical. And David has also taken a huge interest in the COVID-19 event, has followed the reporting on that and the alternative media very closely, and has also, followed the work of Madhava Setty and Dr. Meryl Nass, who are going to speak next, and really, really deeply appreciates their work. And David wanted the opportunity to sort of introduce them and interface with them in this event. And so, David, would love to hand it over to you, and looking forward to your remarks.
Okay, thank you. I'll be introducing Madhava Setty and Meryl Nass in just a few minutes. In some dialogue I had with Madhava on social media in a Q&A after one of his articles, he asked me the question of what motivated me to get involved with 9/11 research. And this actually, I think, relates to some of what he wants to talk about. So as a reference point, let me share a little bit about how this all began for me. Whenever I'm asked how I got started with my 9/11 research, I say it started in the 1980s. I was working with a church in Southern California that was sheltering refugees from Central America as part of the sanctuary movement. The U.S. was backing dictatorships in El Salvador and Guatemala that were murdering their own people in large numbers. They were sponsoring death squads, bombing whole villages from helicopters. One of the refugees we were supporting, named David, described being on the receiving end of one of the bombings. He kept saying, "It's terrible, it's terrible." And it was very moving. The U.S. also sponsored the Nicaraguan Contras. These were the former National Guard troops that had served the ousted Somoza dictatorship. And the CIA trained them in Honduras to make cross-border terrorist raids into Nicaragua, where they attacked villages, destroyed crops, and mined the roads. The US press was blatantly and systematic lying about it all. I knew they were lying because I had a direct line of communication with aid workers on the ground and heard the stories of the refugees themselves. The stories in the press were just that, stories, complete fabrications. This knowledge allowed me to calibrate the press. I never took them at face value again. On the surface, this may not seem to have anything to do with 9/11, but that experience destroyed my sense of American exceptionalism. I was an Eagle Scout. I grew up thinking America was virtuous. I discovered we were not being who we claimed we were. This experience was disillusioning and painful. The morning of 9/11 2001 was colored by my earlier experiences. I immediately sensed that the chickens had come home to roost. I've since learned that was a quote from Malcolm X, I believe. Anyway, being aware of our record of horrendous violence, out of sight, out of mind, I was not surprised that all of the violence would blow back on us. When it became apparent to me a few years later, based on hard evidence, that 9/11 was an intentionally self-inflicted wound, I lost my place. There was no barrier in my mind to keep me from following the evidence that led to that conclusion. In my case, it was this preconditioning that plowed the ground for me. Other people had their wake-up calls with the assassination of JFK, RFK, MLK, or Malcolm X. For others, it was the Vietnam War. I recently read someone who said her wake-up call was reading Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Some people, no doubt, opened their eyes cold turkey, despite the barrage of propaganda following 9/11. These preconditioning experiences have the potential to open our eyes. 9/11 and then the COVID crisis and its response are bigger than the labels on those events. It's bigger than the labels would indicate. Peter Dale Scott calls these structural deep events, which he defines as deep events large enough to affect the whole fabric of society. Whether it is the assassination of a key individual, murder of dozens or hundreds of witnesses, the spectacular murder of a few thousand people as a pretext for war, or the hidden murders of hundreds of thousands or even millions of people as victims of biowarfare agents. Once you have understood the willingness of US government elites to perpetrate such crimes, the idea that they could never do this evaporates. Enlightenment in the case of one such event opens the door of plausibility in future events. Plausibility still needs verification, but there's plausibility as a step. As Niels Harrit mentioned a few minutes ago, truth is a one-way street. I found a niche in the 9/11 truth movement because my physics background gave me eyes to see some aspects of the events in a useful way. There was a natural fit. However, eventually I immersed myself in the medical freedom movement as well. I'm not an expert in medicine, but I understand scientific experimentation. I can analyze data, also apply logic, and recognize propaganda when I see it. Most importantly, I can follow a reasoned argument. I have common sense, and I have developed a sense of who I can trust. And these apply to people who may not have specific talents. Finding our way through all of this is ultimately a community endeavor. I first became aware of Madhava Setty through his writings and talks about all things COVID. He works with the Children's Health Defense, writes articles, and gives frequent talks and interviews. It was some time later that I was surprised to see references in his writings to the anomalous collapses of the Twin Towers and Building 7. In one amazing paper, he wrote about coming out to his MIT classmates about his views about 9/11. It was well after I was familiar with his work on COVID issues that I learned that he started out as an engineer with an engineering degree and only later switched to medicine. I'll let him speak for himself, but my impression is that 9/11 helped open his eyes and helped serve as a bridge to his COVID research. I think we both recognize that we're seeing 9/11 and COVID as two acts of the same play. Meryl Nass, another MIT alum, has a background that bridges a whole series of events. She waded into the swamp of calling biowarfare, bioterrorism, and biocorruption in general from very early in her career. She was the first to prove that an anthrax epidemic in Africa was actually an instance of biowarfare. The white population that controlled the scene was using anthrax against the Black majority population. She witnessed the corruption and scams surrounding the treatment of Ebola, HIV/AIDS, Lyme disease, Gulf War syndrome, and the anthrax vaccine, which was administered widely through the military without adequate testing. Her involvement with the 9/11 came through her investigation of the anthrax letters that we should not forget were actually part of the overall 9/11 psyop. They were used to tie 9/11 to Iraq and Saddam Hussein and pave the way for the Patriot Act. After all of her work on the national and international stage, she was hounded out of her medical practice by a local medical licensing board in Maine because she advocated for hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin rather than going along with the irrational, contrary recommendations of the CDC and the FDA and the WHO. I watched the live-stream episodes of the medical licensing board's kangaroo court that attacked her livelihood and found the atmosphere to be both comic in its incoherence and horrifying in its mindless vindictiveness. The International Center for 9/11 Justice is an outgrowth of the 9/11 Truth Movement, but as a group, we, and with this symposium in particular, we're looking beyond the specifics of one particular set of events to the destruction of democracy and the rolling coup d'etat that has been going on since the early 60s and continues to this day. For the purpose of bridging between the two structural deep events known as 9/11 and COVID, Madhava Setty and Meryl Nass are ideal guests to bring their perspectives on the larger picture. I'm going to be reading just a straightforward bio for each one of these before their talk. First, Madhava Setty will go first, and I'll just read this, and then I'll come back on and give the bio for Meryl Nass. Dr. Setty is a board-certified anesthesiologist with 20 years experience. Prior to receiving his medical education and training at Baylor College of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Setty was an engineer in the aerospace and defense industry, where he designed software interfaces between graphics engines and real-time combat training simulation. The acoustic data acquisition systems under contracts with, I can't even pronounce the word, Bundeswehr, I guess. But I don't read German, sorry. And the Office of Naval Research. Dr. Setty holds an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from MIT. During the pandemic, he left his clinical practice. He became a doctor. But then during the pandemic, he left his clinical practice to serve as the senior science editor of The Defender, the online publication for children's health defense. Setty is the author of Woke, an Anesthesiologist's View, a systematic examination of the bias in science, history, and media and our own minds. He writes An Insult to Intuition. That's the name of his Substack. Okay, present Madhava Setty. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for that gracious introduction. And it's an honor to share this platform with the intrepid researchers here. So thank you, Ted and UK Column, for inviting me to speak today. Sometimes I'm asked if I appreciate the irony of being an anesthesiologist trying to wake people up. I say that things aren't always as they seem. When patients ask anesthetists what we charge for putting them to sleep, you can bet what the answer will be. We always say we do that for free. We only bill you for the waking up part. Chaperoning an unconscious, fully anesthetized patient into an awake, interactive state takes patience and keen attention. In fact, when we try to bring them back too early, it can lead to life-threatening consequences. Anesthetized patients must go through an intermediate stage, what we call stage 2, on their way to the awake state. Interestingly, this state is characterized by hyperreactivity, increased cardiovascular tone, and the emergence of dangerous reflexes. I bet here that many of us have tried to play the central role of the anesthetist, attempting to wake our friends or family members from their slumber, it doesn't always go well. Those of us in the 9/11 Truth and medical freedom movements face the same challenges. Indeed, one could argue that we face the same adversaries. It's been my hope for a very long time to bring these two groups together so that we can brainstorm and help each other. There is the potential for a potent synergy between these two movements because in the end, both seek the same things: a seat at the table, an opportunity to question those who have spread lies under the veils of patriotism, science, or a need for more security. Large institutions will have to be dismantled. But before that can happen, pervasive illusions will have to be revealed for what they really are: illusions. This is going to take cooperation. I'm going to take my time to offer some thoughts and strategies we can use, each of us, to be more successful. People are asleep. We hear this quite often in our circles. I don't like the term asleep. It connotes inactivity and unresponsiveness. The public at large is better thought to be in a dream state. They are dreaming a vivid dream where our authorities are imperfect but have our best interest in mind, where our military might is necessary to fight evildoers outside our borders, where agencies of public health and their officers are doing their best to protect us from the dangerous pathogens lurking in nature, in caves, and in wet markets. The asleep are far from unresponsive and inert. They will, against common sense, cling to their dream and fiercely defend it when challenged. It was only 7 years ago when my wife casually showed me a 30-second video on YouTube. I thought it was a hotel in Las Vegas being demolished. In my experience, showing someone a clip of Building 7 going down will always lead to some kind of awakening. The person will open their eyes to one of two new realities. Either they will see for the first time, like I did, the level of deception carried out by our authorities and the media, or they will realize for the first time that you, their trusted friend, have been a closet nutjob conspiracy theorist all along. It was much later when I realized that my reaction to seeing that video for the first time was rather unique. I didn't go to the internet to see what people were saying about this. I went straight to the official explanation given by NIST, NC Star 1A, the final report on the collapse of World Trade Center 7. How did they explain this rapid, symmetric, and complete collapse of a steel skyscraper that had very little damage to begin with? An unseating of a beam from one of 80 columns on one floor? Really? So they constructed a computer model, a finite element analysis. The model didn't behave like the building. They proved their hypothesis wrong. Period. End of story. I brought two friends together, one a mechanical engineer, the other a PhD in bioelectrical engineering, and laid out the basic facts to them. NIST's hypothesis was dubious to begin with. Their own model proved they were wrong. They incomprehensibly chose to not look for explosive residues. What's to discuss? All we had to do next was to call NPR and the New York Times and let the truth out. This was going to be very, very easy, but things aren't always as they seem. My two educated friends were unaware of Building 7, and they were amused that I was asking some questions, but as soon as they realized that I was seriously questioning the official story, their eyes glazed over and their ears went deaf. A doctor with an engineering degree proves that all of the applied mathematicians and structural engineers at the National Institute for Standards and Technology were wrong? Something like that could never happen in their world. And there it is. They discovered that their friend, me, had been taken in by misinformation. And I discovered that there had been a different world in front of my eyes all along. A world where people who should know better didn't. A world where a graduate education taught some people to obey first and think for themselves second. I didn't think that was possible. Now I realize that this phenomenon is rampant. It didn't take long for me to see that we don't need any more evidence. We have a much bigger problem in front of us. We are confronted with people who adhere to a faith-based position. Faith-based positions can never be overturned with an evidentiary argument because the evidence will be deemed invalid long before faith will be abandoned. After all, faith is choosing to believe something despite all evidence to the contrary. My first attempt at penetrating the shell was to write a book, which invited the reader to examine their own biases first, and then laid out the most unequivocal evidence for controlled demolitions on September 11th. But by the end of 2019, it was clear that what was really needed was another massive deception. I prayed that the powers that be, whoever they are, would once again tip their hand with an audacious and poorly disguised act so that the world would wake up. Just 3 months later, people, mainly the elderly and infirm, were succumbing to a very real and pernicious virus, which miraculously jumped from bat to human with no evidence of any intermediary steps. The insanity began almost immediately. I'm not a virologist, but I've worn a mask on my face for 40,000 hours. We know very well what they can and cannot do. Every single doctor in the world remembers when they were a medical student and walked into an operating room for the first time. We were told 2 things from the jump. Don't touch anything unless you're told. And if you have to cough or sneeze, don't look away from the patient. Why? Any fool knows that what you cough up goes out the sides of the mask. Now these same doctors were putting masks on healthy people outside. Doctors bizarrely insisted that a yet-to-be-developed vaccine would provide better immunity than an exposure to the pathogen itself. This was completely unsubstantiated and ran counter to basic tenets of immunology. These same doctors denigrated their colleagues who were able to treat COVID with cheap, repurposed drugs with success. The entire medical community was commanded to not even attempt to treat people who were ill. Our authorities effectively shut the world down. None of it was scientific or sensical. So, I got my wish. And as a rational, observant scientist myself, I concluded the obvious. I must have been responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic. Sorry about that, everybody. It's worthwhile here to pause and note how closely the 9/11 script was followed in 2020, as Drs. Harrit and Robinson mentioned earlier. The purported threat emerged from a cave in Asia, while in actuality the methods and key materials involved were a product of military research, most likely our own. Forensic evidence that would prove the event was engineered was not sought or was hidden from public view. All legacy media championed the same official narrative from the jump. Any suggestion that an alternative explanation existed was treated as treason or heresy, and all the age-old responses used to deal with witches and heretics were put into play. Careers ended, protesters were vilified, reputations were effectively burned at the stake. The chosen response required enormous public expenditures, which funneled hundreds of billions of dollars into the 2 most powerful lobbying industries over years. Objections to the official story were prevented from entering published technical literature. The bedrock of what we scientists consider objective reality was corrupted. Governmental organizations like NIST and the CDC offered faulty analysis, but yet maintained their command over the narrative. Finally, fear generated by the event or events led to a massive erosion of freedom. In both situations, the public suffered the death of innocent lives from a real event or events, and the public's perception in the aftermath was distorted through very sophisticated methods of mass programming. These were psychological operations, psyops. The 9/11 Truth Movement and the Medical Freedom Movement faced the same challenges in remolding public perception. If it is an Al-Qaeda or a wet market mishap, who then is behind all of this? This is a reasonable and primary question we get asked. And common answers are 1, powerful psychopaths that get off on human suffering. 2, profit-driven companies that make trillions when such tragedies occur. 3, a depopulation agenda that has been in play for decades. 4, commercial bank owners that reap vast sums on the back end of public deficit spending made possible by central banks every time humanity faces a catastrophe. Undoubtedly, some or all of these possibilities are true, but what is behind all of them? In my opinion, this is a dance that has been in play since humans have existed. It is the interplay between love and fear, or more practically speaking, between freedom and control. We don't have to identify all the central characters in this drama. However, we should be able to see that a small group of individuals cannot control a vast majority against their will. It would be an inherently unstable situation, as history has proven over and over again. The public must ask to be controlled. The first step would be to get the populace to tolerate, or better yet, request surveillance of private communication. This, I believe, was the primary intent behind the events of 9/11. The next step would be to convince the public that censorship is necessary for their own safety. This was accomplished extremely efficiently with the pandemic. I say efficiently because it wasn't radical ideologues that were targeted. Highly credentialed and published doctors and scientists were muzzled and defrocked. If a population allows their scientists to be silenced, they will allow anybody to be silenced. It doesn't matter if you want to call it a globalist agenda, a deep state, or a corporatocracy. At this point, it doesn't matter. They're telling us what the plan is. Worldwide threats of pandemics, terrorism, and misinformation must be met with multinational cooperation. Governments and private industry must work together. This idea is not new. In the past, we would call this fascism. Today, it is called public-private partnership. We have to win public opinion to put a stop to this. We are in the difficult position of having to shift public opinion without the support of large media platforms. Legacy media is complicit in every massive conspiracy. This is most certainly why changing sides is so difficult for most people. It comes with two difficult pills to swallow. The first, if you can't trust the media, how can you be sure of anything? And second, it leads directly to the fact that one has to rely on one's own wits, intellect, gumption, and intuition. In other words, it exposes an uncomfortable reality for the most educated. They have learned how to submit to their instructors and not how to challenge them. In my experience, those with letters after their names are in the deepest state of denial around this. Given that most of the public accepts, more or less, the narrative coming from the top, a movement towards clarity must come from the bottom up. To nurture a grassroots movement, it is vital to understand what we are up against. Mike, if I could have the next slide, please. Solomon Asch was a social psychologist who conducted a number of pivotal experiments at Swarthmore College in the early 1950s. I want to take a few minutes to review what these experiments revealed about people's perception and the need to conform. The subjects were given a very simple task: to identify which of the three lines most closely matched the referent, which is on the left. Without any influence from others, the task was indeed quite simple. They identified the correct line 99.3% of the time. However, when put into a group of 7 actors who offered the same wrong line as the answer, more than 1/3 of responses conformed to the majority's incorrect response. Interestingly, Asch identified distinct subgroups of subjects among those who conformed with the incorrect majority. There were those who knew the majority was wrong, but went along anyway. There were others who believed that they themselves were mistaken, so they conformed. And a third group whose perception changed to conform to the majority. The point here is that there is a proclivity to conform, even to an opinion which is known to be incorrect. As I just mentioned, only about 1/3 of respondents were influenced by the incorrect majority. The other 65% or so stuck to their guns. But in these experiments, there was no punishment for standing alone. When it comes to bucking the ascendant position with regards to 9/11 or the pandemic response, publicly resisting the narrative comes with severe castigation in the form of social exclusion, being called pejoratives like anti-vaxxer, anti-science, or a conspiracy theorist. During the pandemic, dissenters were forced to leave their jobs or faced delicensure. There were even public calls to shame the unvaccinated and deny them medical care. Soon after the events of 9/11, Muslims in the United States became targets of suspicion. In 2003, I was a young doctor living in a small town. I had a thick beard and long hair. One morning, a state police detective appeared at my front door, asking if he could come in and take a look around. I let him in. He eventually told me that the building superintendent reported that I owned an instruction manual about how to make bombs. He saw it on my bookshelf when he was servicing my air conditioner the day before. The book was called The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. It was a New York Times bestseller. There was no real pressure to conform in the Ash experiments. Moreover, compared to Ash's simple test of what is true, it is much more difficult to trust one's own eyes when it comes to building demolitions or vaccine safety, especially when the chosen cadre of experts tells us that our eyes cannot be trusted or that the science is too difficult for the public to understand. Make no mistake, those who orchestrated the events of 9/11 knew very well that they could blow up 3 skyscrapers on a Sunday, Tuesday morning in Manhattan and blame it on someone else. We who can see clearly are indeed a minority, and a courageous one at that. This is another reason why it is vital that we stand together. The results of these experiments and others are clearly well known to authorities and their operatives who seek to ensure that their false narratives take hold in the collective. They are also aware of another phenomenon. Mike, if I could have the previous slide, please. Ash uncovered in subsequent experiments that the human mind, though it's prone to conformity, especially when it comes with distinct advantages, the Ash experiments offered some hope. In a series of further experiments, when one of the actors was instructed to dissent with the incorrect majority, subjects' tendency to conform with the majority was reduced significantly. All it took was a minority of dissenters to break the spell of the presumptive legitimacy of the majority. Basically, it's far safer to switch groups than it is to stand alone. This is why there has been an all-out effort to ensure that those with opposing opinions do not get a seat at the table. No debates are permitted. Scientific literature is scrubbed of findings that run counter to the narrative. Independent scientists lose their accounts on social media, and independent media platforms get demonetized. We, the ambassadors of clarity on these pivotal matters, are the dissenting minority, and we pose a formidable threat to the powers that be, but only if we do not squander our opportunities to engage with the other side when such opportunities arise. I would like to leave you with some observations and suggestions which I believe can be helpful for everyone, especially if you don't have an audience or a platform. Remember that practically speaking, facts are subjective. Time and time again, when I ask intelligent and educated people what it would take for them to change their mind, the most common answer is, I will believe your facts when the New York Times reports them. We can only be certain of what isn't, not what is. Be careful insisting that you are absolutely certain about what happened or what is playing out. Being certain is not a reason for anyone to believe you. It is much easier and productive to dismantle a false narrative than to prove what is. Science is, after all, the never-ending pursuit to establish what is. Avoid using the word truth. Truth implies certainty and immutability. I prefer using the word clarity. In other words, a viewpoint that is free of bias. That is actually the best that we can do. Be aware of false narratives from our side. In order to upend the myths told by the CDC, the Office of National Statistics, or the MHRA, we must convince doctors that they have been wrong. Only then will these agencies of public health surrender their sway over public health. There's no way any doctor in the medical orthodoxy will listen to you when you begin with the idea that viruses do not exist. It may be fair to say that you haven't seen evidence strong enough to convince you that they do, but averring that they don't is epistemologically unsound, as you would be asserting the null hypothesis proven. Similarly, using the argument that plane wings made of aluminum could never damage steel is incorrect. If the energy of collision is great enough, both the aluminum and steel would be destroyed. The obvious problem is that making unsound statements leads to a wholesale rejection of all the valid points you may have. I have found that well-intending people on the side of clarity do as much damage to our efforts by making false claims than those of the orthodoxy who push the false narrative. When you're engaged with someone you disagree with on social media, understand that that person is never going to concede. That's not the goal. The objective is not to convince them that they're wrong. The objective is to convince the audience that you have a better argument. Very often, the audience will not be able to judge who has the better argument, but will be willing to open their mind if you comport yourself better than the other side. Legacy media is the primary conspirator in all large conspiracies. We are winning this battle right now. Please support independent media. It is vitally important to form networks with many nodes, not one or two large voices of truth. It's much easier for them to attack one or two highly influential spokespersons than a distributed network which is loosely affiliated with each other. Share content from lesser known voices. Know your audience. This is not always possible. It's best to start where there is the highest likelihood of agreement. I recently spoke to an old medical school classmate of mine who I hadn't talked to since before the pandemic. She's a doctor in Texas. I assumed that she probably realized that the COVID vaccine didn't do a whole lot of good, but was unwilling to accept that it was dangerous. So I started there. I was surprised to discover that in her experience, the vaccine was very protective initially, and she was furious at people who didn't get vaccinated. My chances went to zero immediately. And finally, I'd like to offer some strategies to engage with people who believe they're too smart to be taken in by misinformation, whether from authorities or from a subversive conspiracy theorist like me. Knowing versus believing. What's the difference? People are very quick to equate believing with knowing. Knowing comes with an inner certainty and deep understanding. Believing comes with trust in another source, one that could be fallible. When given an opportunity to address an audience that may not agree with me, I began by demonstrating how easily even an alert mind can conflate believing with knowing. The National Science Foundation here in the United States conducted a survey in 2012, and they asked 1,000 people if they thought the sun orbited the Earth or whether the Earth orbited the sun. 25% of those surveyed got it wrong. They believed that the sun went around the Earth every day. 25% seems like an embarrassingly high number, even for Americans. However, if you knew that the Earth orbits the sun every year, how would you prove it to the other 25% without referring to a third party? How did we prove it to ourselves 400 years ago? The reality is that no matter if it is the year 2024 or 1624, you can't look out your window and know. Moreover, it actually can't ever be proven from observational astronomy from the Earth's surface alone. We had to first accept that the motion of objects with mass can be reliably predicted before we could assert which model is, in fact, true. The point here is that of those 75% who got the answer right, very few know it to be true. Unless a person understands what could be known, when it was known, and how we arrived at our conclusion, they don't know that the sun sits at the center of our solar system. They're just believing what others have told them. Unwillingness to research source documents. This is another possible way of engaging a person who claims that they are steadfastly objective. How do they know that the 3 skyscrapers in Manhattan fell by a gravitational collapse and not a controlled demolition? Unless they have read the technical explanations of these events offered by NIST, they will have to concede that they are trusting a third party's opinion of the official analysis. They're free to do this, but their position is founded in trust, not objectivity. I have yet to speak to a person who believes the government's 9/11 tale who has actually read any of NIST's technical documents. Neither have I met a single person, doctor or otherwise, who believes the safe and effective narrative who has read any of the published data and methodology around the initial mRNA vaccine trials. Putting the cart before the horse. One of the biggest impediments to clarity around evidence that points to a very large conspiracy is the idea that it couldn't possibly be true to begin with. If this belief is held as axiom a priori, it would be logical to dismiss any evidence that supports the conspiracy. In essence, evidence is invalidated because of a foregone conclusion. This is completely backwards. Objectivity requires us to assess the evidence first and then draw a conclusion. People are free to approach this backwards if they wish, but they cannot say that they're being objective or scientific. They are, in fact, being dogmatic. What do you do when experts disagree? The vast majority of people are not experts, even in their own fields. How then do they approach a situation where experts outside their own fields of study disagree? First, one has to be aware that there is a body of dissenting experts. Many are not aware that there are thousands of architects and engineers that believe the official 9/11 story to be wrong. Many are also unaware that there are superb, extensively published medical researchers, epidemiologists, and doctors who don't agree with our agencies of public health. This begs the question, on what grounds can a layperson or even a highly educated person know who is right? If they were being truly objective, they would have to acknowledge that this is indeed impossible for them. And it opens up a powerful way of cracking the dogmatic prison that they are in. They should be able to see that both sides are mirror images of each other. Both insist that they are right. Both sides accuse the other of being inexplicably gullible and falling for false narratives. Both accuse the other of spreading dangerous misinformation. But there is only one difference between the two. One side is pleading for a debate, and the other believes that such an exercise is not just futile, but dangerous. This doesn't prove anything, but it invites the question, how would the side which outlaws debate ever know if they were wrong? So in conclusion, I want to say that I am very optimistic. Clarity will eventually emerge. I have never met anyone who once thought the Twin Towers were blown up, then changed their mind and go with the official story. Neither have I ever talked to anyone who suspected that the mRNA shots were dangerous, did some earnest research, and then head over to the CVS to get jabbed. It's a one-way street, and their side is losing by attrition. With more dissenting voices will come a more rapid movement towards clarity. This is precisely why the powers that have commandeered our media are intent on siloing groups, hyperpolarizing the public, and pushing for censorship. Their strategy is to separate and fragment, and ours must be to unite. We don't have to agree on the details to be on the same team. Thank you.
Thank you. That's excellent. I have a short bio here for Meryl Nass. I'll just read it through. Meryl Nass is an internal medicine physician and was the first person in the world to prove that an epidemic, the anthrax situation in Rhodesia, was due to biological warfare in 1992. She has given 6 congressional testimonies regarding anthrax, biological warfare, Gulf War syndrome, the vaccine, and vaccine safety, and has consulted with the Cuban Ministry of Health, the World Bank, and the Director of National Intelligence. Since the COVID pandemic began, she has written detailed articles regarding the suppression of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin for treatment of COVID, the cover-up of COVID's lab origin, and how the WHO's proposed pandemic treaty and amendments will lead to more pandemics. She is an advisor to the Children's Health Defense. Her medical license was suspended in January 2022 for providing early COVID treatment and spreading alleged vaccine misinformation. She's been writing and speaking on all things COVID and is now focused on the biosecurity agenda of the WHO and its goal to wrest sovereignty from individual nations under the guise of pandemic preparedness. So thank you, Meryl, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Can I have the first slide, please? Good. Thanks very much. I wanted to say just a couple of words about Graeme. Graeme was someone I knew for a number of years, although I'm not sure we've ever met in person. He had invited me to speak a couple of times. We both were very interested in the origin of the anthrax and the anthrax letters. I'm sure both of us were very disappointed that we still haven't gotten to the bottom of that. And Graeme did me a very important favor before he died. Back in early 2021, he got an invitation to attend a Zoom with a lot of scientists and doctors around the world, and he wasn't able to do it, but he asked me if I wanted to attend. And that really is what started my linkages with, particularly in Europe, but in other continents as well, groups of scientists and doctors. And those connections have stood me in very good stead while I've investigated COVID some more. So I'm very appreciative to Graeme for thinking of me and for what a fine, wonderful human being he was. All right, so I'm going to try to go historically very quickly and give you a sense of what biological warfare is, and that it isn't something, theoretical. It really happens. It probably happens a whole lot more than we know. And it's about to, hit us in the head with more and more pandemics unless we do something about it. So I've taken a page from the United Nations to try to explain what are biological weapons. Well, they're any microorganism that is living that can reproduce, or the products of microorganisms like toxins, or they might have started out as microorganisms, but with gain-of-function research, they've been made even more pathogenic, virulent, or more transmissible, or both. And so that's what they are. Normal bacteria, viruses, fungi can be biological weapons if they're put in a weapon, if they're deliberately spread. Doesn't have to be any difference between the normal disease and an offensive act of war. And that's why using biological weapons can be very desirable for a nation or a subnational group, because they can be made to seem as if they're natural occurrences, unlike chemical and nuclear weapons, where you can't do that. This is the first well-documented next slide, episode of biological warfare, which happened in Crimea in 1346, when the Mongols were attacking the Genoans, who had a walled city, and the attack lasted over a year, and they still couldn't win, and they started hurling dead bodies over the walls of the city with a catapult device, and this caused the Black Death plague, and the Genoans got in their boats, went back to Europe, and spread the Black Plague to Europe. Next slide. Here, we all know the British gave smallpox-infested blankets to the Indians when the British were fighting in the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania. Next slide. Unit 731, is a book about a massive Japanese program of biological warfare, which did human research studies on unwitting humans. And these weapons were used for sure in China during World War II and possibly before, killing estimated 100,000 or more Chinese. Next slide. It wasn't only the Japanese, but the United States had a well-developed biological warfare program during World War II also. This book was published in 1947 by actually the deceased husband of a woman who became my friend. He had worked in the program against the Nazis, and when the war was over, said we need to stop this program and shut it down. And the U.S. government said, "No way, we like this." And so he left and published a monograph about exactly what the U.S. had been doing during the war and the agents against humans, plants, and animals. In other words, food crops and food livestock. And this picture on the right is a device that was used to test experimental animals. And force them to breathe in pathogens. Next slide. So 25 years after the end of the war, Nixon announced he was going to end biological warfare in the U.S. and around the world. And the United States would work with the British to create a treaty that would ban all biological warfare going forward. However, the United States reserved the right to do defensive research, such as research that could lead to vaccines. And we were supposed to get rid of all of our biological weapons, but it turned out later that did not quite happen. So the Biological Weapons Convention was developed. It was finalized in 1972, went out for signatures, and it went into force in 1975. However, initially it had no provisions for doing investigations in countries of allegations of possible use or possible development of biological warfare agents, and there were no punishments. These were to be figured out later. And so every 5 years, a review conference has been held ever since then to try to strengthen this treaty and make it actually, workable, enforceable, and so that it could stop the use of biological weapons agents. Unfortunately, the U.S. has been the major country blocking the development of more stringent ways of dealing with biological warfare. In 2004, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution against the proliferation, use, development, acquisition, etc., transport of both nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And this was particularly an attempt to prevent proliferation of these weapons. So the Biological Weapons Convention is signed and ratified by the United States, and this UN Security Council resolution also applies to the United States and to the rest of the world. However, while the United States was negotiating the Biological Weapons Convention, it used African swine fever on Cuban pigs. And this led to a required culling of 500,000 pigs. Virtually every pig in Cuba, which was their main source of meat, had to be killed because of this infection. There were whistleblowers who explained how the CIA had provided the virus, how it went to Panama and then eventually to Cuba. I knew that the Washington Post had published an article about this, as did the San Francisco Chronicle and Newsday. And it was really hard to find the Washington Post article, but here it is. And then I discovered above that this was actually a CIA sanitized version of this story, which was reported in 1977. In 1981, Cuba was suffering from the second very severe dengue virus attack with a different strain. There are 4 strains of dengue. And they had a different strain the second time, and hundreds of thousands of people were affected by it. It's a painful viral illness that lasts a few weeks. It's called breakbone fever, and it kills babies and young children and killed 113 Cubans. And it had not been present in the Western Hemisphere previously. And Castro was suspicious that this may have been a biological warfare attack as well, particularly when they had suffered the African swine fever, sugarcane rust, blue mold on tobacco, and some other potential biological warfare episodes, all of which the U.S. they were suspicious that the U.S. may have caused. I remember when I was a consultant in Cuba, I was told that I was a consultant for this epidemic in 1993, and I was told that planes registered to the State Department had flown over Cuba shortly before they had outbreaks of these various diseases in their food crops. This was a peculiar new syndrome that affected 50,000 people in Cuba and turned out to be due to cyanide, which was probably in the water or the food. I also, and this is what I investigated on my own. When I was in Cuba, there were many people investigating that epidemic, and I was one of several who came up with the source being cyanide, combined with nutritional deficiencies that were going on in Cuba at the time. But I was the first person in the world to take any epidemic and show that it was due to biological warfare. And in this case, it occurrhed during Rhodesia's civil war, which was also a race war between 1978 and 1980, again, when the Biological Weapons Convention was in force, although without enforceable provisions. The Russians were also breaking the rules. There was an accidental leak at an anthrax factory in Sverdlovsk, which was a partially closed city, so there were very few foreigners allowed to live or be in that city. And the Russians covered it up, said it was due to eating infected meat, and eventually local doctors hid the slides that revealed that this was anthrax and unlikely to have been due to meat. It was due to an airborne infection. And Matthew Meselson at Harvard showed that all the deaths appeared in a straight line, which is the direction the air flowed away from this anthrax factory. This was some U.S. research published in the Tampa Bay Times in 1990. Insects may be the new weapon in the drug war to control coca crops in other countries. Clearly, unless the government of another country allowed the United States to spray insect pests on their coca crops, this would be considered an act of biological warfare. And this article from 1993 in a book called Coca Biological Control Issues talked about how this is a list of the various pests that can damage coca crops, and down below how they may be enhanced to do a better job of destroying the crop. I thought I would look back and see when Ralph Baric started to work on coronaviruses, because it was hard for me to understand why anyone would work on coronaviruses before 2002. Why would tax money go to pay for that research? In 2002, we had the first outbreak of SARS. It's now called SARS-1. It affected about 8,000 people. About 800 people died, and then it disappeared. But it was considered a potential biological warfare agent, and there was a lot of research done after 2002 on it. However, here, Ralph Baric, he was maybe even a student at that time, in 1983, was publishing on this mouse hepatitis virus, which is a coronavirus. And at that time, the public and doctors only knew that coronaviruses caused colds. We were not aware that they caused any more serious illness in human beings. And really, why the NIH and the National Science Foundation would be paying to study viruses that cause colds is a question. But by 1998, Ralph Baric was still working on this coronavirus, same one, But now who is he working with? He's working with Lisa Hensley, who was at Fort Detrick, the Army's Biological Warfare Center, which was converted to be the Army's Biological Defense Center after Nixon made his proclamation. And what are they doing? They're looking at interspecies transfers, which we now know are being called, what are they being called? Think about it. Come on. Well, it's called, jumping species is one thing. It's called. What else? You see, they don't want to use these terms. They want to make up new terms. So in any event, I actually can't remember the name now, but it's a very common spillover. Yes, spillover is the invented terminology so that you don't go back and look at research that talks about interspecies transfer. Interspecies transfer here obviously happens in a lab. Spillover is supposed to happen out in the wild. But how often does that happen, and how often does it happen in the lab? Also, in that slide, you can see that when they did transfer this virus among different species of experimental animals, it affected the organs that it affected the organs that became infected, and they, in some cases, the virus became more virulent, which would obviously be of interest to a biological warfare / defense Army unit. Now, jumping to 2014, the United States under Obama announced that it was going to start a big global health security agenda, that biological warfare and pandemics were not something that the United States could deal with on its own. But in fact, these things could start anywhere and then come and bite us. And so we needed to get the rest of the world up and ready for biowarfare events or pandemics. And so at this point, the United States said, we're going to pay over 40 nations to do this type of work, and we're going to help them get their biodefense measures ready. And this is going to be a big deal. And the United States started pouring billions of dollars into this. And what were they doing? Well, they wanted interoperable systems for disease detection in real time. What does that mean? A big part of that means they want your medical records, and they want them in real time because they want to see, or allegedly they want to see, whether a lot of similar syndromes suddenly pop up in a part of the world and whether this is something that needs to be immediately investigated. But what does it also mean? It also means they now have a lot of potential blackmail material if you have had an STD or you've been drinking too much or whatever. If your medical records contain what is supposed to be sacrosanct information, but according to the biohealth security agenda, the government and the WHO now need this information. This also was the beginning of talking about a whole of government approach, sort of elevating the seriousness of this biodefense, bioterrorism concern or risk to something that we all needed to be tremendously concerned about. So this is a paper published in Nature, probably the premier science journal in the world, about research that was conducted by Ralph Barrick, his graduate student, who is now a professor himself at Galveston, Vinici Menachery, and I believe Xi Zhengli was involved with this. But it was already clear that risky gain-of-function research was happening and the world needed to be concerned. And many scientists were. And what the Obama administration did was said, okay, don't worry, we're going to put a moratorium on this work. We're going to stop it until we figure out how to do it safely. But all they did was actually stop the gain of function research for coronaviruses, SARS-like viruses, and for avian flu viruses, and they didn't stop gain of function on anything else. I'm going to be jumping into where things are going now. And before I do that, I want to just give my confirmation that which the other speakers have already said, is that I think COVID, as well as the anthrax letters, were deep events, and they look very similar when you see what preceded them and what succeeded them. So each had a scripted simulation. Each was asserted, perhaps wrongly, to have originated in countries that were already being targeted by the United States. Each led to tremendous spending. Probably 150 billion to 200 billion has been spent on biodefense since the anthrax letters. And, we don't even know how much has been spent since COVID appeared. In each case, fake investigations were done, and a real investigation was thwarted. Each one led to increasing surveillance of the population. The anthrax letters and the Twin Towers and the other events of 9/11 resulted in the global war on terror, which meant we can justify a war anywhere, wherever we liked, and it could go on. And we didn't have to really explain it. We could just do it. And I don't know why the world has allowed that, but it has. And then in 2021, the biosecurity agenda has brought the low-intensity war home. And now we realize it's on everybody else, but it's also on us. So where is all this going? Let me set the stage. Why did Tony Fauci, despite all evidence to the contrary, insist that COVID had a lab origin? It wasn't only because he wanted to protect himself. There were deep agendas at play. It got his agency more money. It supported the whole biosecurity agenda, which is, based on the fact that pandemics come from spillover from animals, from wild animals, and that they don't come from labs. So if you acknowledge that COVID actually came from a lab, your whole justification for spending hundreds of billions of dollars on the biosecurity agenda falls apart. But also, they had figured out that this natural origin zoonotic spillover story could be used to support the climate change narrative, to justify this other crazy thing, which I'll get to, called the One Health agenda, and to blame overpopulation and specifically human activity for pandemics. And they were even able to figure out how it would justify censorship, because we had to censor conspiracy theories because we needed China to cooperate with us on understanding COVID. So we had to censor people who were saying anything against China. Yeah. Very well planned. So this is what Tony Fauci and his associate David Morans published in September of 2020. Quote, "In a human-dominated world in which our human activities represent aggressive, damaging, and unbalanced interactions with nature, we will increasingly provoke new disease emergences. We have to think and we have to live in more creative harmony with nature." This is Tony in 2020. Here's the Telegraph, which is the Wall Street Journal of the UK, and they're quoting Dr. Daszak. "We may be much more vulnerable to these pandemics than we think. We may be creating a perfect storm. This is about how do we as a species deal with what is potentially an existential threat to our existence." This is all three of these are from September of 2020. This was the narrative that was being pushed out. And the next day, Peter Daszak tweeted, "What's shocking is that we all thought this would happen, and here we are. Pandemics, hurricanes, wildfires, economic recessions, all a result of our continued and relentless abuse of the planet." All right. So you can see the narrative is really being spun. Next slide. Aha! It's the wildlife trade. World Economics, Forum. Scientists warn worse pandemics are on the way if we don't protect nature. Next slide. New York Times. The pandemic is your fault. We're not taking good care of the environment. Next slide. The Guardian. Destruction of wildlife and the climate crisis is hurting humanity. With COVID-19, a clear warning shot, say experts. And this was coming from the UN's environmental program chief. And how now they move to start spinning that pandemics are due to climate change. Climate modeling may be used to offer an early warning of future disease outbreaks. Again, Nature, the top science journal in the world. Rolling Stone, let's get the young people propagandized as well. How climate change is ushering in a new pandemic era. I have about 20 headlines like this. So this was a very powerful push to convince everybody that climate change and pandemics go hand in hand, and we must manage both if we are to survive future pandemics and if we are to survive climate change. Now I am moving over to what's going on at the WHO. So now that the scene has been set, the stage is prepared, the WHO and countries like the United States and the UK decided we had to do the claim was, this wasn't really what they wanted, but the claim was we'd done such a bad job managing the last pandemic that we had to do a much better job. And our main problem was equity. We hadn't shared our vaccines fairly with the developing nations. And so clearly we needed a new way to handle pandemics in the future since they're about to get sprung on us all the time. So what happened was the document on the left, which has been in existence since 1969, was to be massively amended. So a whole new set of regulations would be put into place. And then the document on the right would be created. It did not exist before, but the nations are going to create a pandemic. It's called a pandemic agreement now. It used to be called a treaty, accord, instrument. It's had 5 different names, but they've settled on agreement as I think a happier sounding term. And this has the meat and potatoes of how the new pandemic agenda will be managed. What do these documents actually do? So there's been about 9 versions of the treaty, and there's been about 3 versions of the amended international health regulations. So I have to show you things that are in most of the versions, but not necessarily every single draft. And we don't have a final draft of either document yet. Teams are still negotiating them as we speak. There's going to be a meeting in 9 days to begin discussing and voting on them, and yet there is no final version, which breaks the rules. Each of them, the regulations needed a final version 4 months in advance, and the treaty needed a final version 6 weeks in advance, and the WHO doesn't care if they break their own rules. All right, what was going to happen? This is what was desired. So these things were all in earlier versions. Enforced nations were required to surveil their citizens' social media presence and emails and stop the spread of misinformation or disinformation that goes against the WHO's narratives. Human rights protections were crossed out in the original version of the regulations. They had been in. The earlier version said we have to carry out these directives, with protection of human rights. That was crossed out. It's now been added back, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're preserving human rights. Orders versus recommendations. So the recommendations in the IHR which international health regulations were previously recommendations, but now that the negotiators have added the word shall many dozens of times in both documents, and in international treaties, that means the nations must obey. So even though they say that the WHO won't be giving orders to nations, that is not the case. It will. And it has a compliance committee to make sure that the nations comply. And it is demanding that each country have a focal point, which will investigate whether the country is in fact complying. Okay, so the WHO would have the right to tell you what drugs you must have, what drugs you're not allowed to have. Its budget would increase by about a factor of 10 or more. It required nations to be able to roll out vaccines without a license and without testing or very minimal testing. And it required in earlier versions that they roll out liability shields for such products, since what manufacturer wants to make a vaccine and roll it out with no testing if they don't have the liability protection. They wanted digital vaccine passports. Now, in the latest version, they're saying digital or paper, but they still require vaccine passports. All right. One Health is another thing that is in the treaty. I'm using the same story from a fairy tale. One Health is exactly the emperor's new clothes. It is a meaningless construct that is designed to throw everything in the world, because the world includes people, animals, plants, and ecosystems. They will all be thrown into the basket of One Health and turned over to the WHO to manage when there are emergencies in any of those areas. Here we have the so-called experts who have created the most recent One Health Joint Plan of Action, and it means nothing. Except they love water, food, energy, and biodiversity. They're going to be on top of all of that, and they're going to work together to drive change. Here, the Lancet sort of let the cat out of the bag and published an article on One Health, pointing out that it takes a fundamentally different approach to the natural world, one in which we are as concerned about the welfare of non-human animals and the environment as we are about humans. So pretty much everyone who sees that is very worried about what that really means. Are humans to be at the level of cattle? This is a list of what the One Health Commission thinks of some of the things that fall under the rubric of One Health. You can see they've thrown the kitchen sink into that list. This was just rolled out last month by the US government, and they're talking about their One Health approach. And the US government now has said, as of April last month, that they're going to pay for 100 countries to develop their global health security strategy. They're concerned about zoonotic disease spillover, biosurveillance. They want to share your information. They're big on stopping people from killing and eating wildlife or trading it. And they want to fix climate change. But this is very strange. They're now saying that health systems that contribute 5% to global warming. And so they want to change health systems so they don't do that anymore. Make of that what you will, but I wonder if part of it is telemedicine and another part is giving us many fewer tests. Another thing the WHO is trying to do is create a biohub system to share biological materials with epidemic or pandemic potential. That means dangerous things that can cause pandemics, they want to actually collect in a lending library and share. This was in the June version of the treaty, and it said basically, if you're doing gain of function research, you're studying transmissibility and pathogenicity of dangerous microorganisms, then do it safely, but minimize unnecessary administrative hurdles for the research. Now, what the heck does that mean? That looks like they want more accidents. This was in a later draft of the treaty, It's talking about the pathogen access and benefit sharing system. So the most dangerous viruses and bacteria and fungi are all going to go into this biohub, and they will be shared, and nations will get some money if they share them, and they are used to make drugs, vaccines, or tests by pharmaceutical companies. This was in the February 14th draft of the treaty, just 3 months ago. And what did it say? This is the only time they actually use the terminology gain of function in one of these drafts. But it told us what they were really aiming for, that the Director General of WHO would appoint a committee of scientists, and then they would supervise gain of function research with these very dangerous pathogens. So what's going on? Well, one way to look at this is can be seen in a letter that only came out on Friday, that Senator Roger Marshall wrote to the Inspector General of the Defense Department. And he said, look, the Defense Department has been funding a program that involved Peter Daszak and his colleagues, an expensive program called PREDICT, and it also involves Metabiota, which is Nathan Wolfe, also a shadowy figure who apparently dated Ghislaine Maxwell for a while. He said, well, we U.S. government paid for this PREDICT program, and you collected thousands of potential pandemic pathogens. And between 2014 and March of 2020, the military has paid more money to get all of these dangerous pathogens from the University of California, Davis, which was the prime contractor for the PREDICT program. And so he would like to learn more about what was coming from China to the United States, et cetera. So he's asking the DoD IG for documents. But this is very interesting. So the United States already had this program going on, at least 10 years ago, to collect all of these pandemic pathogens and put them in our own Fort Detrick biohub. But now we're globalizing this program, PREDICT, and we want this collected pathogens from at least 31 countries that I'm aware of. But now we want all the countries to be finding and sharing their own pathogens with the program. If you share these organisms widely, you won't only have accidents, but you're going to also have trouble figuring out whether they were deliberately released or they appeared because of an accident. It means nations won't even have to bother developing their own biowarfare labs because they'll be given the weapons themselves. And because nations have also been required by the WHO in these documents to sequence the pathogens and put the sequences online, hackers can download them and obtain them as well. However, as I said, the United States was doing this for 10 years. It looks like the WHO has been doing this for 3 years. They launched a biohub with Switzerland 3 years ago to do exactly the same thing before any of the nations gave the WHO permission and said, we want you to have a lending library of potential pandemic pathogens, i.e. potential biological warfare agents. The United States is also preparing for a permanent pandemic state. It launched its pandemic office last year, and who's heading it? Of course, a retired general. And yes, some of the reason to do this is because there's a lot of money to be made from pandemics, and it is a way to give out more vaccines. It might be a way to cull the population. But I think it's bigger than that, and it has to do with trying to achieve a one world government using the UN/WHO system. So let's go back to One Health. The Lancet has a One Health Commission also. I mean, many billions of dollars have been spent to build out One Health agencies and commissions all over the world, even though it doesn't help you to do anything any better and probably worse than the way things have been done before. But what do they say? What is the ambition of the One Health Commission is to galvanize transformations in global governance. Here's the European Union. They have even though they're just the EU, they have a global health strategy. It's a changing world. So a new global health order is emerging. Global governance will require a new focus to maintain a strong and responsive multilateral system with the WHO at its core. And so the UN put out this document last year. It wants to go in the same direction as the WHO, and some people think this is a plan B, that if the WHO does not get what it wanted, which I'm sorry I didn't say it earlier, but what these WHO documents ask for is for the Director General to be able to unilaterally declare a public health emergency of international concern, and then he can roll out whatever orders he wants to deal with it. So he doesn't have to ask anybody permission to do that. And then the nations will have to go along. The UN is proposing the same thing, that the Secretary General on his own bat would be able to declare a global shock, a global emergency. And then he wants standing authority to convene and operationalize automatically. That means without the agreement of the General Assembly nations, 193 nations that are part of the UN, and he can just get an emergency platform going and tell nations what to do. This is from that same document. It's this graphic says these are the objectives of an emergency platform, and what you would expect to see is the objective is to have fewer deaths, to get supplies to the area quicker, to manage things better. But those are not the objectives at all. The objectives are to gain high-level political leadership, to use words like equity and solidarity that don't really mean much. A coherent multilateral response means run by the UN, inclusive and networked multilateralism, whatever that means. Advocacy and strategic communications, whatever that means. Securing commitments, that means money, and accountability means you get punished if you don't go along with it. So what are the objectives? What are they really looking for? It's not clear, but the Secretary General wants the same right that the Director General of the WHO wants, which is to decide when to call the emergency and then decide what to do with it. Next slide. And also like the WHO documents, which tell you how much it's going to cost and what the details are going to be later, after committees that haven't been formed yet decide, the UN is going to do the same thing. We'll tell you what this is going to be like later. Next slide. Okay, let's call this what it is. The proposed International Health Regulation Amendments, Pandemic Agreement, One Health, and the UN's emergency platform are simply legal mechanisms designed to gain jurisdiction over the nations and people of the world using the guise of public health and potential emergencies. We don't want it. We don't need it. There's no scientific or logical or medical justification to centralize control of emergencies in the hands of these agencies that have never successfully managed any emergencies before. The best thing to do is to try to delay consideration of these treaties and not vote for them at the meeting starting on May 27th. But if we can't do that, then what we need to do is vote no. The Dutch parliament has instructed its government to do that. 11 nations told the UN back in September that they were not going along. And there are several other nations whose officials have also said publicly they were not going along. Unfortunately, today, there was a helicopter accident with the Prime Minister of Iran. Iran was one country that was not going along. And 5 days ago or 4 days ago, there was an attempted assassination of the Prime Minister of Slovakia, who also said his country was going to not go along with these two treaties, and he has been in serious condition. He is still alive. We think he's going to live, but he's still badly off. So those may be the consequences of trying to go against this attempt to gain maximal control over the entire world. And let's localize control over health. In the United States, 22 attorney generals have done just that. They have pointed out that the Constitution says that powers not given specifically to the federal government by the Constitution are revert to the states, and healthcare is one of those powers, and they will be managing the healthcare of their citizens in 22 states. Thank you very much. They do not need the WHO, and they will not be following the orders of the WHO. So this is what we need to do everywhere, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. This whole issue is so overwhelming in terms of the scope of, using biology to, biowarfare issues here as a means of power and control and so forth. And I look at that in comparison to friends of mine who basically say, just, hey, so there was a virus that got out and we have a vaccine to fix it and we're on our way. I mean, it's such a complete, utter blindness to the world that you're suggesting is really going on here. So it makes me wonder how to bring this to the attention of people who, I'm overwhelmed. How do people who haven't even looked at the COVID thing as being a scam, how do they react to this? I mean, how can we bring it to them?
Well, I think you need bite-sized pieces, right? So this was a 9/11 audience, so I threw a great deal at you. But I think showing people what Fauci said, for instance, or what Peter Daszak was doing, may be helpful. And it depends. I mean, different people are concerned about different things. I think the fact that the WHO could mandate untested vaccines on us is extraordinarily dangerous. Maybe the most dangerous thing of all, although I'm equally worried about these pandemic pathogens that are going to get out. But I think most people, and I tried to give a history of biological warfare to contextualize it so it didn't seem so far out to people. It seemed like something that really could happen, that has happened to other countries. The fact is that the guy that invented the idea of developing a vaccine in 100 days. So the two people who brought that concept to Davos were Bill Gates and Jeremy Farrar. And Jeremy Farrar was the head of the Wellcome Trust. So two of the biggest funders of medical research in the world. And that was in 2017. And they said, they founded this organization called CEPI, Coalition of Academic Innovation and Preparedness. And 100-day vaccines is their plan. Design them in 100 days and manufacture them in 30 more days and get them to everybody in the country by then. And there's no time to test them in humans with that schedule. But Jeremy Farrar was moved from the Wellcome Trust to the WHO to roll this program out on us and to bring forth these WHO documents, because he's funded developing nations' health systems in the past. And so he has power, he has the connections to try to bring countries into the tent. And so he took a huge drop in salary to go from director of the Wellcome Trust to be the chief scientist of the WHO. And he's there to do this to us. So it's not a fantasy that they're going to roll out vaccines, in 130 days. It's very real, and they're going to be untested, and you're not going to be able to sue anybody if they kill you or injure you. So that may be a stepping stone to helping people explain the enormity of what's happening.
I did a little video. I mean, this is my own little thing. The reason I didn't take the vaccine before I knew anything about the vaccine was the idea that if you have something like a medication that has, say, 99.9% safe and then a 0.1%, will kill you, that might be justified if it's going to be given to the people who are sick. But if you give it to the whole population, 0.1% of the population of the United States is 300,000 people. So if you have a disease that might kill 10,000 people, and here's this vaccine with this 0.1% chance it'll kill you, you're talking about killing 300,000 people to potentially save 10,000. I mean, the math of it just doesn't make sense. And the idea that vaccines,
well, that's, the centralization doesn't make sense. Let me interrupt you.
Yeah.
So if you're practicing medicine, you can't, Tedros isn't even a physician. He's got a PhD. If you're practicing medicine, you've got one patient in front of you and you do a risk-benefit calculation for that patient. You don't subject that patient to more risk than benefit. And so to have, the WHO tell everybody in the world they have to take something and nobody does the risk-benefit calculation, is basically criminal. It goes against everything in public health. So sorry, I wanted to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying the standards for something to address a specific issue, that's one thing. Something you're going to give to the whole population, whether you need it or not, is on such a different, the idea of that is such a different scale. I don't think people get the picture. Anyway, I should give up the floor and let some of the other people ask questions to you or Madhava or both or whatever. So whoever is running this show, go for it.
Thank you, David, for your comments and for your really wonderful introductions of our last two speakers. That was really helpful. I'm just going to say a few things because it's been a long symposium. We want to start wrapping it up. So I want to thank Dr. Setty and Dr. Nass. You've made amazing presentations, so full of really valuable information. Dr. Nass, so much background on what's been going on and what plans they have, what they're doing to us. Just things like I had no idea U.S. had actually a history of using bioweapons against Cuba and other places. That's interesting to know. But thank you for letting us know about how this World Health Organization pandemic treaty and the health regulations are starting to fall apart. Many countries are not supporting it, and how we, certainly us in the United States and other countries where people live, how we can contact our lawmakers, tell them, no, we don't want this. This is not good for our health. It's not good for humanity. And Dr. Setty, thank you especially for the tips you gave us on communicating and engaging more effectively with people in the pursuit of, as you would say, clarity. Yes, we need more clarity. And I just want to invite everyone in the audience as they move forward and take what they've learned today to do so and act in the spirit of Graeme MacQueen with peace inside, a strong inner peace, with courage, with fidelity to pursuing clarity, and with love of humanity. Ted, you can close it out.
Yeah, thank you, Marilyn, and thank you, David. As Marilyn mentioned, there were beautiful introductions to the last two speakers, and thank you to them for their tremendous contributions. I will be going back and watching the presentations again. I learned a lot, and from all four presentations. So thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. We will be posting this on our website. It'll also be on the UK Column website, of course, along with links to some of the main publications or websites of each of the speakers if you want to dig in more. I know all the speakers are doing incredible work, and I'm sure that many of you will want to follow up with that information. So thank you again to everyone. It's been a great afternoon, and I think Graeme would be proud of the knowledge and the spirit that was shared during the symposium. So Thank you very much, and be well.